Should I start?
2 seconds. Yes, you can start.
Okay. I very much welcome you to this peer webinar, which aims to share research on the health impacts of climate change, pollution, and the loss of nature. It's going to be recorded, and it's going to be a strict time for the presentations, but it's a Q&A, or actually it's not a chat function on the top of the screen. So if you have questions to specific presentations, please write your questions there, and we have it as a kind of roundup Q&A session by the end of the seminar, which will end a few minutes before 1 o'clock, because that's when I have to run to another activity. This seminar highlights how we can plan for good cities that are equipped to handle climate change, protect nature, and promote public health. PEAR is a partnership of 8 of the largest European environmental centers. The aim is to combine forces with a joint strategy in environmental sciences to enhance research on ecological sustainability. 6 researchers from various peer institutes will provide relevant knowledge and experience related to urban planning, environmental justice, assessment of mortality and morbidity related to urban green spaces, as well as environmental sustainability of urban expansion. The first one is David Fletcher, who works at the UK Centre for Ecology and Hydrology as a spatial modelling and urban ecosystem services specialist, with a particular interest in mapping impacts and benefits, both monetary and health, and analysing equitability of urban green and blue space. He is also interested in developing novel methods to overcome data gaps or resource limitations and allow ecosystem service assessments in data-poor environments. So, David, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Let's just get that on screen. There we go. Okay, so yeah, thank you for the introduction. I'm David Fletcher. I work for this Centre for Ecology and Hydrology in the UK, and I'm talking very briefly about the City Explorer Toolkit. So this is a web application. It came into being originally funded by a European Space Agency Future Earth partnership. They funded us to create a data demonstrator for COP26 in Glasgow, and I created it as a web app in our Shiny. The app contains ecosystem service models, and the idea was to provide a tool for planners and policymakers to be able to plan where to put the green and blue space in their cities to have the greatest benefit for health. So it allows them to create and modify scenarios, plans, to run models for ecosystem services, and then to compare the outputs of those. It's now being developed by partners Geospatial Insight on a more appropriate platform, because it's kind of outgrown the R Shiny platform. So the general framework that we use, this is a simple framework. We consider the pressure, so this might be particular air pollution like PM 2.5. It might be temperature, heat in the cities, particularly over the last few years has got worse and worse. The supply, this is the modelling outputs, and this relates to the mitigation or reduction of the pressure. And then we have the opportunity, and this relates, it takes into account what is currently in place, how bad the pressure is, and it tells you what could be supplied, how much mitigation could be provided if you were to change what is currently there to the optimum land cover. So ecosystem services is innately anthropocentric, and so the people are really important in there. And when we combine the people with the pressure, the supply, and the opportunity, we come to, with pressure, When we factor in the people, we get the impact, and this might be health impacts and often is. When we factor in the people with the supply, then we're getting a benefit, we're getting a reduction in the impact. And when we factor in the people with the opportunity, this is potential benefit. How much benefit could there be if we made the changes? So speaking about the integration of people, this is really important for us. So this is a screenshot of the app, and it shows a reduction in air pollution concentration. And this is our social weightings tab. This allows the user to change weightings. So we've got different social groups. Currently, we have an income deprivation indicator broken down into deciles, but this example shows the different age groups. So we can change the weightings for each of those different age groups according to perhaps their vulnerabilities or sensitivities to the pressure that we're considering. So in this example, we've got high weights for the oldest and the youngest in the population, and this might reflect the way that heat or air pollution disproportionately impacts the oldest and the youngest in the population. And when we apply that, you can see there's a slightly more refined output, and you can see the hotspots there in the purple colours. And these relate to tower blocks where there are higher densities of people. Actually, in this city, which is Portsmouth in the south of the UK, the age groups are very evenly distributed. So this really is probably reflecting more just population density. But one of the other cities, Aarhus in Denmark, that had a less even distribution of the age groups. And actually you could see when you change the weightings, particularly for the intermediate age groups, there is a higher concentration of them in the city centre. The other thing that we do is allow the comparison of the different scenarios. So if you imagine you have multiple scenarios, or perhaps you've had an iteration of design where you've created a scenario, you've run your models, you've looked at the outputs, and you've decided to make some additional changes. This example shows 3 different iterations or development stages. 1, 2, and 3 there, and the baseline scenario. And at the top, we've got a breakdown of the different land covers, showing the percentage land cover. And you will see in the trees column there, I've been adding trees incrementally there. And you will see in the grassland column, I've basically been planting trees on grassland. So the grassland reduces, the trees increase. We have the actual supply of the ecosystem services there. The change in concentration, you can see that increases as we go through the development stages. The quantity removed in kilos per year, and then the cooling, I think, is offline at the moment, so it's not registering a change. It's actually still under development, but we would expect to see a slight increase in the cooling as you go through those developments too. And there we have a comparison. You can see the bars here. So we have blue as the baseline scenario, and then we have our incremental changes. And you can see actually there is a slight difference in the level of benefits across the age groups, and actually the 0 to 6 age group does get marginally more benefit, and this is the reduction in particular air pollution concentration. So they gain a bit more than some of the other age groups, which is a good thing because they're more sensitive to that. But it's generally fairly evenly distributed. But this is the kind of thing that allows the planners and policymakers to be able to compare the different scenarios or different stages of development to see which ones they're getting the best gains from. So just to wrap up, future and ongoing work, we are looking at updating the cooling model. And actually, it's very much in line with some work that we're going to see presented by Marianne. Some work that was done in the ReGreen project. So we should be able to arrive at health impacts and then evaluation of the health impact for cooling. We're looking to do the same for our PM 2.5 model, where we will quantify the health impact via a dose response relationship and evaluation of that. And we're also developing an access to green space model, although that will be more difficult to quantify the health benefits, although there are some pieces of ongoing research that are looking very good with that respect. So I think I'm probably coming up to the limit of my time, so I'd just like to thank you for listening. I invite you to visit our website and sign up to our mailing list if you're interested, to keep up to date with any changes. So we're looking to get some changes pushed and made to the application soon. And there's my email address down at the bottom if you have any direct questions that we can't answer after the other presentations at the end of this session. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much, David. And if you have specific questions, as you say here, please use the chat, Noah, and we can come back to you because you were well within the time limits of your presentation. But we proceed with Léa Tardieu, who's an environmental economist at INRAE in France. Her research focuses on eliciting individual preferences for the implementation of biodiversity conservation policies, such as light pollution reduction, greening policies. She also works on the modeling and mapping of ecosystem services to better account for human-nature interactions in land use, planning policies, and projects. So please, Léa, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much for the invitation. I wanted to begin with this headline of a big journal in France, Le Point, where we have a headline of the town halls overwhelmed by the unauthorized opening of fire hydrants during heat waves. This photo was taken in Pantin, in the northeast of the Île-de-France region, containing Paris, in Seine-Saint-Denis, which is one of the poorest department of metropolitan France, with one of the lowest ratios of green spaces. So here I wanted to show that to show you that environmental justice is a big question in this case. So how green space distribution is connected to health, because green spaces are associated to physical and mental health, to health of newborns, with social cohesion, with local climate regulation, with very much ecosystem services that directly or indirectly impact health. And access to green spaces reduce inequalities in mental health, mortality, in multiple diseases, and we have benefits that are more important for disadvantaged people. One problem is that urban planning and green space distribution rely on targeting criteria, and that those targeting criteria of greening policies are almost exclusively based on access to nature. So there are indicators like planning for 1 tree for 10 inhabitants, or a number or square meter per inhabitant. So having every inhabitant living at less than 300 meters from a green space, etc., like the target 11.7 of Sustainable Cities of SDGs. Why is it potentially a problem for environmental justice? Because there are cases, and we will see that in the Paris metropolitan area it is the case, where wealthy populations have lower access to green spaces. So if we target low access to green space, it is, well, the result will be that we will target areas with already wealthy populations. So we wanted to propose an indicator that will target people accumulating multiple inequalities. Just the context, the Paris metropolitan area, we have the city of Paris in the center, and we have a low access in the city center of Paris, but also in the inner suburbs of the metropolitan area. And our example of Seine-Saint-Denis is in the northeast here. Here you see in red very low access to urban nature. But as I said, in Paris, we have no correlation between income and employment or other thing between access to nature and income. So as I said, targeting those areas with low access to green space with this as an only indicator will potentially favor wealthy people. So we developed a multi-dimensional index to target future greening by accounting for that, and we relied on the definition of welfare developed by Stiglitz and Fitoussi, which define welfare on 8 dimensions of well-being, being a material living condition, health, education, personal activities, political participation, economic and physical insecurity, social connections and relationships, and environment. And we developed proxies to represent these different dimensions of welfare to develop our multi-dimensional index. So then we selected a multi-dimensional well-being inequality index as we wanted it to be sensitive to 2 things. One, the unequal distribution of well-being dimension. So if we have, for example, unequal distribution on 1 dimension, for example, access to green space. And the second thing, we wanted the index to be sensitive to the cumulative impact on inequalities, so that if deprived population also have little access to green spaces. Then we mapped it in the Paris metropolitan area, and we simulate 1 change only on 1 dimension, the greening of each district. And we were able to develop this map where you can see, for example, where you can see the impact on inequality of increasing the access to nature, with for example, in light blue zone areas where residents have access to green spaces, so greening is not a priority. You have in dark blue zones habitants that are wealthy and very wealthy in multiple dimensions of our definition of well-being. So here again, maybe for environmental justice perspective, it's not a priority to target those areas, but you have red zones, for example, where you have people that are accumulating multiple inequalities in terms of access to green space, income, and the others dimensions like the exposition to different pollutions, unemployment, etc. So here, if we have an environmental justice perspective, we have to target in priority those areas. So the wrap-up is that targeting greening in areas with only the least green spaces can result in favoring the wealthiest population, and that we propose a multi-dimensional inequality index that can have a significant impact on social spatial inequalities. Now it's a bit old paper, and we are doing actual work regarding this particular question. We are extending it at all big metropolis in France. We are extending it also with the access to different ecosystem services like heat mitigation, flood regulation, outdoor recreation. And we are also analyzing the past 45 years of planning decisions to see how it enhanced or decreased inequalities overall. Thank you very much. And here is the publication and my email if you have also more direct questions.
Or thank you very much, Leah. Or you can then write in the chat if you have some, not necessarily questions, but comments or reflections, because this can then be followed up by the end of this webinar. But we proceed with Sander Venter, who has his roots in South Africa, where he completed his doctorate and developed spatial modeling skills. Since moving to Norway, he has worked on a range of topics, including urban climate, ecosystem services, and ecosystem accounting at Norwegian Institute for Nature Research. With an interest in human geography, he enjoys collaborating with social scientists on questions of social and environmental justice. He will now present an article which explores spatial patterns of green justice in Oslo, which, as you know, is the capital of Norway. The floor is yours, Sander, please.
Thank you, Odin. I'm just sharing. Yeah, so I'm going to talk about a paper that we published, I don't know, a couple of years ago now, looking at environmental justice in Oslo, a topic which was environmental justice was covered nicely by Leah in her presentation. Yeah, so we all know, and it's been presented already, how important nature is for public health, both mental and physical, and general well-being. And maybe it's particular in Norway, given the large cultural identity is tied up in outdoor, being outdoors in nature. There's a specific Norwegian word, friluftsliv, that directly translated free air life. Being outdoors is strongly associated with a sense of well-being and, I guess, cultural identity, social cohesion, and particularly there's also a Norwegian word, nær natur, which means next door nature, which from an ecological point of view is sometimes viewed as quote unquote degraded, or maybe less valuable than quote unquote pristine nature. But in the context of public health, next door nature is probably the most important nature to conserve, because it is directly within a proximity of where most people live, especially in cities like Oslo. And scenes like this, I come from South Africa, and also published a paper on environmental justice issues in South Africa, and there, and generally in the global South, you find these extreme spatial inequalities in the availability of green space and access to green space. That, you know, over the distance of a few hundred meters, there can be extreme changes in income and access to green space. But we were interested in exploring this in Oslo. In Europe, these patterns are also evident, but no one had really quantified this in Oslo in a sort of spatially explicit way using maps. And maybe Oslo and Norway is an interesting case because you know, Norway is on the top of the Human Development Index, Better Life Index, Democracy Index, not this year, but previous years in the past. It was a European Green Capital in 2019. So it's sort of an intriguing question to look at, does environmental inequality actually exist in this very green capital that's sort of the poster child of social and environmental sustainability? And also, in the context of this webinar, how does it relate to environmental hazards like air pollution and open heat? So we we mapped out, or we have census data on income. You'll see on the graph on the map on the left there. For those who aren't familiar with the Oslo geography, I apologize, I could have included a better map, but the important thing to pick up here is the overlap or the association between these variables. And in the middle, we quantified green space availability, and on the bottom, blue space, which is also a sort of aspect of urban nature that's often under communicated or under studied, access to water and rivers. And then on the right, we also had densification patterns. Oslo is a city that has a municipality that has a clear strategy to densify around transit hubs, to prevent urban sprawl and preserve nature around the city. But we find these positive associations, correlations between affluence or income and both blue space and green space. And we also find, a negative correlation between densification and blue space and green space. So areas that are densifying typically have more gray, less green space, blue space. Areas that are relatively wealthier have more access and availability of blue and green space. And one statistic from our paper is that citizens living within 100 meters of a water body are likely to earn $20,000 more per annum than those living 500 meters away. So we try to quantify it in economic terms. But this is a map showing sort of the coincidence of income and green space. Green space operationalized as NDVI, which is the satellite spectral index. Areas on this map that are dark blue have a high income and high green space availability. Areas that are gray have low income, low green space availability. And you can see in a very green city like Oslo, there are these extreme spatial contrasts, maybe not at the same spatial scale as in the global south or distance, but they do exist. So these just two images showing different urban morphology and availability of green space. So why does this green space availability or environment, why does this matter? And what we also included in our paper is looking at exposure to, or not specifically exposure, but the presence of heat and air pollution hazard across the city. Exposure would imply some population weighted measure. But we find that areas which are low income have higher surface temperatures and air pollution levels. And we didn't find a strong association with ethnicity, percentage of Norwegian natives, but we found again an association with densification and population trends. So areas that are densifying also are exposed to higher temperatures and air pollution. So this isn't necessarily proving or showing a causal relationship between blue-green space and air pollution and surface temperature that have been shown in other studies, but it sort of speaks to this extra environmental injustice that it's not only inequality in access to blue-green space, but then there's these environmental hazards on top of that. You hear something in the background, that is the Norwegian Defence. They're doing a test at the moment of the alarm system. So yes, we find spatial inequality in blue-green space in Oslo, the green capital of Europe, and it overlaps with patterns of environmental hazard. But I think some of the more interesting questions that we're working with in our group at the moment and going forward is looking more at the mechanisms behind these patterns. And one sort of working hypothesis that my social science colleagues have is that maybe it's not so much, it's this concept of golden ghettos, or these wealthier areas that are extremely resistant to change, and they are maybe a key driver of segregation in Oslo. and this sort of golden ghettoization of Oslo. So this map here shows is a better satellite image of Oslo, and if I overlay the affluence or the income map, you can see the golden districts have high income, and that sort of area is this golden ghetto in Oslo, and they are remarkably resistant to change, given social capital, cultural resource, the ability to resist developments that, for example, might include low-cost housing or even densification, having more citizens move in. So it's sort of a contrast to the typical gentrification pattern, where wealthy people move into a previously disadvantaged area and thereby exclude them. This is almost the converse, where wealthier people are staying where they are, but excluding the integration of maybe lower income people in that area, and preventing both private and public intentions to develop the city landscape to make it more inclusive and more even in terms of green and blue space. And there's also exclusionary housing market as an extremely important mechanism here. And yeah, we sort of critical of the compact city paradigm in Oslo, this intention to densify around transit hubs, and there are some unintentional side effects of that. You might be preserving nature surrounding the city, but then you're sacrificing access to next door nature within the city and exacerbating patterns of inequality. So yeah, the paper is online if you want to have a look. And feel free to contact us. There's many parallels with other research initiatives in cities in Europe that we'd love to connect over.
Thank you very much, Sander. And we have got the first comment and question in the chat, and Leah has even managed to answer that, but we can then go back to it. And if you have questions or comments to Sander, please put it forward there. Then we proceed with Marianne Sanderson, who is a professor of environmental economics at the Department of Environmental Science at the Aarhus University in Denmark, and works with studies of the population's view and values in relation to what nature means to us and what ecosystem services it contributes in relation to climate adaptation, climate mitigation, improvement of water quality, biodiversity, and outdoor life. Marianne was the coordinator of the EU project ReGreen, which David referred to, on urban nature in Europe and China, and will present results from ReGreen work led by the University of Exeter on the evaluation of reduced heat mortality risks from urban parks in Paris, France. The floor is yours, Marianne, please.
Thank you very much, Audun. I'll just briefly talk about ReGreen. So we were 20 partners. The project ended in February last year. You're most welcome to visit the website that's still running, and especially the Synodo, a permanent repository of all our output, of more than 30 peer-reviewed articles. So David from UKCH was very much an important part of this project, and we aim to integrate knowledge and evidence on benefits from nature-based solutions in urban living labs. And today I'll focus on the results from some of the results from the Paris region, and that fits very nicely with Leah, your work. So I think this unintentionally makes a nice fit. So this is work, as Audun is led by Joe Garrett, a research fellow at the European Centre for Environment and Human Health at University of Exeter. It's a manuscript that's still forthcoming, but we're in review phase. And it's also based on work by looking at how to get the spatial and temporal data to create daily urban air temperature products from remote sensing. So that without that, we couldn't do this work. Just about heat waves in an urban setting. So heat waves represent the deadliest form of extreme weather in Europe. And it's really because of the public health risk of heat-related illness that can lead to heat exhaustion and heat strokes, which is life-threatening, especially for vulnerable populations, but also aggravates chronic diseases like kidney disease, cardiovascular and respiratory diseases, and increased mortality rate, people actually dying from heat waves and hot days. And this is the part of the public health risk that the study focuses on. But it's a lot more complex and wide-ranging, the impact of heat in urban areas. So there's infrastructure strain, environmental impacts that are exacerbated from heat waves and hot days, and also direct and indirect economic consequences and social inequality, as Sandra and Leah were also talking about, the disproportionate access to green spaces and housing inadequacy and the lack of proper healthcare access and use. So that example there that you brought about the unauthorized opening of hoses in Pontin, that's a very nice way of how to adapt to extreme challenges. So this study looks at 4 central departments in Paris, hosting about 7 million people. So we looked at what are the cooling effects of parks, existing urban parks, on hot days on the surrounding areas, so people living close by. So their accessibility is really important. And how many deaths may be prevented on hot days from those existing parks. And so the method that we used is that we took a subset of the existing green spaces, about 500, 600 spaces in Paris that were more than 1,000 square meters big and at a certain distance from other green spaces and water in order to isolate the impact of the cooling effect of existing green spaces. And this is an example from the square Charline Blondin, where you see on the x-axis, it's distance from the boundary. So 0 is right at the edge of the park, up to 1 kilometer away. And the y-axis is the mean temperature. And if you imagine you're at the red circle and you move towards the 0, towards the square Charline Blondin, you will actually notice that the temperature is decreasing, and that's the evapotranspiration impact. So the work from Neil Bird et al. And the work led by Joe Garrett allowed us to estimate the difference in temperature from existing green spaces. We looked specifically on 4 hot days in July in 2019. And then we did statistical modeling, making the relation between the size, the area of the green parks, and the level of greenness measured by the NDVI, and the impact on the cooling distance measured by the temperature difference. And so this was done for about 575 spaces. And here are the first results. The relationship between the area and the temperature difference. So there's a positive correlation with area and temperature difference. And the same you see also here for the level of greenness, the NDVI. So the more green, so the more trees that you have in a park, the bigger the temperature difference outside the park. The cooling effects, I'll just have to move this thing here. Yeah, on those 3 hot days in 2019 was for 50% of the parks, 0.15 degrees Celsius with a maximum of almost 2 degrees. So that you can see there's a big variety too, and that's really a lot to do with the NDVI and the area. And after that, we then use this relationship of the 575 parks for the 4 hot days to predict that for all public green spaces in the Paris region. And that's a total of nearly 2,000 public green spaces for all hot days in 2019. That was about 40 hot days. And in order to put that in relation to the population, we looked at how many people live within the cooled area. So in this study, unfortunately, we didn't yet look at what type of people live within that area. So this issue of affluence or inequality is not part of this specifically. And then we used a study by Pascal et al. From 2018, looking at the relative risk of mortality in French cities. So on the x-axis, you see the temperatures going from below 0 to up to 30 degrees, and of the y-axis, the relative risk of mortality. And you see that below 0, there's an increase in risk of mortality, but as you move towards 30 degrees, it really increases, and especially above 21 degrees and up to more than 2.5 times higher risk of dying prematurely because of hot weather. So we use that with knowing the difference in temperature with the parks, then estimate that what if the parks weren't there, what's the difference in risk of mortality for the population within the maximum cooling distance of the parks, and that gives us the lives saved. And using the value of statistical life, we then get a measure of that can be used in economic terms. That's the method. Here comes the results. These you see here are estimated maximum cooling distance. It's about the 2,000 sites in the 4 districts in departments in Paris. The green are the public green spaces, the dark gray are the maximum cooling distance, and the lighter gray, if you can see that, those are the buildings. And you can see, and that's also interesting, that in the northeast, northwest, there's a far less access to large green parks. So there's a big unevenness in distribution of parks. So the predicted cooling distance of all those parks was a maximum of 1.5 kilometers, but for 50% of the parks, it was about 50 meters, with a predicted temperature difference of 0.2 degrees, but up to 2.6 degrees. And if we look at the number of people living within these maximum cooling distance, that equates about 2.9 million, so 42%. So you could say that that's a lot, but you could also argue on the other side also that the majority of people don't get the benefits of existing green parks. These are then the results where we apply the amount of lives saved and the value of statistical life. So the blue parks are the most valuable with more than 1 million euros. So this is for the 40 days in 2019. So you can see that with the increasing area, there's also an increasing value associated. But we also find, and that's actually interesting from a planning perspective, that the efficiency of greening green areas is not necessarily going for the very big ones, but also smaller sites and medium sized. And we find that the highest unit area value are between 10,000 and 100,000 square meters. But in total, about 42.5 lives were saved from the existing parks compared to if they weren't there, equating 200 million euros over the 40 hot days. And the most valuable one is Bois de Vincennes, with more than 7 deaths, or 7.4, if we can say it like that, prevented, and more than 34 million euros over those 40 days. So the key messages here is really that existing nature in urban areas is highly valuable for human health and well-being, but they are unequally distributed, and we can also safely say they are underprovided. And larger parks cool a larger area and have bigger impacts, but medium-sized urban parks provide the highest efficiency per unit area. So that's very interesting to take that into account in planning decisions. And finally, I argue that we need to include cost of non-action into economic decision-making and planning. And by cost of non-action, I mean the cost of not implementing urban parks in urban areas, in place of other land uses like housing or parking or commerce. And so there's an argument for including that in order to get a level playing field. So I'd like to thank the whole Regreen team, and pleasure to be here today. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Marianne. This is quite interesting, but we haven't really got that many comments or questions in the chat, so you are now free to do that to follow up. But we proceed with Susana Lopez Aparicio. She's a senior scientist at NILU in Norway, where she coordinates research and activities related to air pollutant and greenhouse gas emissions. With over 10 years of experience on emission modeling, her work focusing on developing high spatial and temporal resolution models for greenhouse gases and air pollutants to support air pollution control, climate mitigation strategies, and urban sustainability. Susanna, the floor is yours, please.
Thank you very much. I assume that everybody sees the presentation. Yes.
It's just fine. Yeah.
Great. To start this presentation, a little bit on why we did this work. Many cities, as we have been discussing previously, has experienced uncontrolled sprawl development. Cities are growing. And this is a case that has been quite extensive in Poland. So our case study is in Warsaw. And the research question that we have is this environmentally sustainable, or is better to recommend compact development? And today I will drive you through different components that you can see on the slides. And from a methodological point of view, first we analyze the past development in Warsaw from 2006 to nowadays. And this we do it based on data analysis. We work at the resolution of residential buildings. We separate those built before 2006, old buildings, and the new developments. That is all these residential buildings built after 2006. We allocate around 300 parameters per building, and then we group in 3 indicators that I will present today. Is the nature, the accessibility to public transport, and the urban diversity understanding as the number of services that you have around where you live. Thereafter, I will present future pathways. We model 2 different: continue the sprawl development or follow an alternative compact. This is done from a point of view of modeling activities. We model first traffic, considering where people live, where is the working places. This is used as input data for emission modeling, and then the emission is used as input data for air quality modeling. In addition, I will present some additional interventions that follow the same pathways. So if we start with the nature indicator, already before me, several have commented about the benefit of having nature around where you live. On the left, we can see the map of Warsaw municipality. In the center is the city center. And the nature indicator is like light color is very low accessibility to nature around where you live, and dark is a high percentage of nature around you. Obviously, as it is expected, the nature indicator increase from the city center to the outskirts. This is expected. We saw similar results from other cities before. But also we took all the residential buildings and we analyzed depending on where they are placed, center, semi-central, periphery, or in the suburban, and also depending on the type of building, if it's detached, duplex, or big apartment blocks, and if they are old or new. What we see is that the new buildings systematically they obtain a higher nature index, and this is because they reduce the nature availability for the previous one. And this we see when we analyze where these buildings were placed. We compare with land use data to analyze where these buildings were constructed. And obviously there is some compacting effect. There is some buildings that they complete the urban fabric, but most of the buildings that in addition are detached house substitute previously classified areas as agriculture, wetland, or forest. So we are changing from nature areas to artificial areas. If we go now to the diversity indicator, understanding what do you have around where you live, this is if you have a high diversity of services, this is important because reduce commuting, promote public transport, and encourage walking and cycling. So in the same way that it was presented before, if we see on the map, the highest diversity, that is the dark color, is in the city center. Obviously, is where you have the highest diversity of services, and this is reduced all the way to the suburban area. When we analyze the areas outside the city, we see that it's a monoculture of detached houses with nothing around you. If we analyze in the same way, depending on the type of building, if it's old or new, and depending on where they are located, we see that the building constructed after 2006, the new development, they have a much lower urban diversity. And if we look at the accessibility to public transport, understanding accessibility as the distance to the public transport, but also the frequency. As it is expected in the city center, we have the highest accessibility to public transport and is reduced all the way to the outskirts. Again, when we analyze depending on the buildings, we see that the new buildings, the new developments occur in areas with a very low accessibility to public transport. So summarizing the developments in Warsaw in the past decade, what we see is that it has occurred mainly in suburban areas, taking over natural areas, and this has entailed a low urban diversity. Basically, we have a monoculture of detached houses with lower accessibility to public transport. This type of development involves increased commuting and also a larger use of private car. So analyzing the future, what is the best for Warsaw if continuing sprawling or an alternative compact development, we analyze in terms of CO2 emissions and air pollution. Concerning CO2 emissions, obviously I don't need to explain the importance in the context of climate change mitigation, but here we represent the two scenarios as a change in the population. In the compact, the population is moved to the city center or the periphery of the city center, whereas in the sprawl development, the population is moved more to the outskirts, the city keeps growing. These scenarios are built by colleagues in Poland considering feasible locations as well. When we model CO2 emissions associated with the traffic, we can see here the result. The baseline is today's situation, and the scenario considering a sprawl will increase CO2 emissions, whereas a compact will reduce CO2 emissions. As you can see, the changes are very small, so we implement also additional measures. We improve the attractiveness of public transport. We move working place to the city center, an alternative in where we move working place to the outside, but also road narrowing. That is considered a very good measure to reduce traffic. As you can see, based on the colors, all the measures are more favorable to reduce CO2 emissions in the compact development, and the best measure is to improve the public transport attractiveness. If we look at the air pollution, on the top, you can see the baseline. This is today's situation regarding nitrogen dioxide levels. It's very clear to see that the main source is traffic. As you can see, the road network is very well marked, and the highest level are obtained in the city center. On the bottom, we decided to show the relative change regarding the baseline. So you see on the left, the sprawl development, and on the right, the compact. Under sprawl development, what we observe is that in certain areas of the city, CO2, again with CO2, NO2 levels increase up to levels of 25%, whereas in the compact development, pollution levels of NO2 is overall reduced, but it's an important detail to bear in mind. In the city center, in where we have the highest level, the reduction is very small. And this is important because air pollution is relevant when we talk about exposure. So we calculated the population exposure to NO2 levels. On the left, you have the baseline, is the red line. Then we have the compact and the sprawl. The red line is kept for reference. One important aspect to bear in mind is that the population exposure in the city center increase because the pollution levels are the highest and we are increasing the number of people living there. And this is one of the reasons that we also evaluated additional measures to reduce pollution. As I said before, we analyze public transport attractiveness and business district in the city center or outside, road narrowing, a much extended road narrowing or even increasing penalties for parking. In this figure, what we show is if the effect of the measure is larger in the compact or in the sprawl. When the color is blue, the effect is larger in the compact, whereas when the color is red, the effect is larger in the sprawl. What we see is that in general, all the interventions are generally more effective in reducing NO2 levels in the compact city development. And a little bit some message to bring home how we design our cities and air pollution are always interlinked because determine mobility, determine even how we heat our houses and so on. And if we evaluate the urban growth of Warsaw in the last decade, there has been an expansion, but at the expenses of previous green areas. This has been replaced by monoculture of detached houses with low urban diversity and low accessibility to public transport. When evaluating potential pathways, continuous sprawling or an alternative compacting, what we see is that the extension, the sprawling increase CO2 and NOx emissions, and the suburban population is the responsible for most of the NO2 in central area due to the commuting. Compacting reduce traffic emissions and NO2 level, but exposure increase in central areas because we are increasing population density. Therefore, additional measures are needed, and what we see is that in general are more effective in the compact than in the sprawl development. And with this, I would like to acknowledge a big team of colleagues both at NILU and in Poland, and that they are all co-authors of the article in where we summarize all these results. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Susanna. This was great. But we, and as I have been saying now several times, we have the chat in case you have comments or questions. But we'll then have the last presentation in this webinar. And this is by Sharp de Vries. I don't know if that's correctly pronounced, but he works at the Wageningen Environmental Research in the Netherlands as an environmental psychologist. His research focuses on cultural ecosystem services, such as nature-based recreation and landscape appreciation, but even more so on the health and well-being benefits of contact with nature. He's also interested in environmental justice issues regarding access to nature and in a quality of life approach to the valuation of nature. Sharp, please, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Odin. I hope my presentation is visible.
This is fine.
Okay, thank you. So I'm going to tell something about our latest study that was published this year. It's about domestic gardens and morbidity in the Netherlands. A little bit background, you already heard quite a lot about it, but the amount of nearby nature is associated with many health outcomes, from birth weight to longevity. but also morbidity. If you want to see a recent overview of that, I can refer you to IUFRO report. Chapter 3 was written by 25 experts from all over the world, mainly authors, you could say, of systematic reviews. And it gives a summary of the health benefits by life stage, young people, children, adults, and older people. In many studies, it's looked at the amount of nearby nature, the percentage of green area or NDVI measure, and that's assumed to be a proxy for actual contact with nature. And the amount of actual contact with nature is important for several potential pathways linking nature to human health and well-being. But if amount of contact is very important in this respect, then domestic gardens, front or backyards, may be a very relatively effective types of green space because you're very much in contact with the greenery in your own garden, assuming that you have one. To begin with, the greenery in your own garden is often also visible from within the home, and there have been several studies during the COVID pandemic that showed that being able to look at green space or nature from your living room window is associated with your mental health. But on the other hand, there are very few studies that look at private green space, and especially owned private green space and health outcomes. There are studies that include private green space. For example, if you use NDVI measures, then also the greenery in gardens is included, but it's not focusing on your own garden greenery. So that was what we set out to study. The research questions are, is having a domestic garden adjacent to the home protectively associated with morbidity? And we looked at common health conditions. Does the absolute amount of greenery in the garden make a difference in this respect? The idea is that more garden greenery is associated with lower prevalences. It's the hypothesis. And also of interest, what's the importance of own garden greenery relative to that of greenery in the wider residential environment, such as public green space, but also perhaps the private green space of others in the terms of front yards. And the final question is, are there important moderators in this respect? The method, we had data on gardens, the size and the amount of green space in the gardens. The garden presence and size was based on cadastral data, and the green space was based on detailed aerial photographs with a resolution of 25 by 25 centimeters. We used NDVI with a cutoff value, green, non-green, and that's how we calculated the amount of square meters of green space in the garden. We also looked at it in the wider environment, but I will come back to that later. The health data, we have health data on individual level for 21 types of diagnosed health conditions, yes or no, yes present, no present, as recorded by general practitioners. And we looked only at people living within city limits and living at the same address for at least 2 years. So we have a data set containing about 800,000 individuals. We performed multi-level logistic regression. We have general practitioner practice as second level. And in the analysis, we included a wide range of covariates on socioeconomic status, on the individual and household level, as well as on the neighborhood level, but also air quality and noise levels and several others. Results first for the first question, having a domestic garden or not. For 11 out of the 21 health conditions, the prevalence was significantly lower when a garden was present, and only one of the 21 health conditions showed an adverse association, and this was for elbow, wrist, and hand complaints. The strongest protective associations were observed for intestinal tract infection, odds ranging of 0.83, that signifies about a 70% lower prevalence of the intestinal tract infection, stroke and brain hemorrhage, about 16% lower prevalence if a garden was present, and heart disease, about 12% lower prevalence When it comes to garden greenery, we divide it in 5 classes. The first class is no gardener present. That's the reference category. And then you do have a garden, but there is less than 20 square meters present of garden greenery, 20 to 50, 50 to 120, and 120 and above. For 3 of the 21 health conditions, prevalence were already lower when less than 20 square meters of green space was present compared to having no garden. So this implies that also for the larger categories, 20 to 50 and etc., the prevalence was lower compared to no garden. That's for 3. When you look at least 20 square meters present, then we found for 8 health conditions lower prevalences, for at least 50 square meters present for 5 additional health conditions, and finally for 2 health conditions we found only a lower prevalence when at least 120 square meters of garden greenery was present. But in total for 18 of the 21 health conditions we found a protective association between garden greenery and the prevalence. The strongest protective associations were observed for, again, intestinal tract infection, stroke, brain hemorrhage, heart disease, but also for acute urinary tract infection, medically unexplained physical symptoms, attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, and cancer. And here you have the numbers, and you can see that the strongest association is observed for the intestinal tract infection, especially when there's at least 50 square meters of garden greenery present. Then the prevalence is over 20% lower compared to not having a domestic garden. The pattern in general is positive in the sense that more garden greenery is associated with lower prevalences. There's one exception, that's here for cancer. Having garden greenery is beneficial compared to no garden, but lower amounts of garden greenery appear to be more beneficial than higher amounts of garden greenery. So this was the only health condition with this exception. So we looked a little bit deeper into it, and it's due to skin cancer. Only for skin cancer we found an association between the amount of garden greenery and its prevalence, but the smaller amounts were associated with lower prevalences than the higher amounts. But always it's better to have garden greenery than to not have a garden at all. We also looked, as I already mentioned, to garden greenery in the wider environment within 125 meters using the same method, the aerial photographs. And 2 conclusions. The results for garden greenery were not attenuated by including the greenery in the wider and residential environment into the analysis. And to our surprise, I might say, the garden greenery within 125 meters itself was only associated with 2 health conditions, in contrast to previous studies that showed that garden greenery within 1 kilometer was associated with many of the health conditions we also included in this study. But okay, for garden greenery, the results were not attenuated by including greenery in the wider environment. When we look at moderation, then sex appears to be a quite frequent moderator in 15 of the cases, with the protective associations mostly being stronger for women. From the 15 times sex was a moderator, in 12 occasions for 12 health conditions, the protective association was stronger for women than for men, and in the 3 other cases it was stronger for men. We also found moderation by age in education, but the pattern is not as consistent as it is for sex. It differed very much between the health conditions, and we found hardly any moderation by home ownership and by the level of urbanity at the neighborhood level. So the conclusions: having a domestic garden adjacent to the home is protectively associated with a range of health conditions, mainly physical, I must say. There were no strong associations for the two mental health conditions, depression and anxiety disorder. For anxiety disorder, we didn't find an association at all, which was one of the rare exceptions. And for depression, only when there was a large amount of garden greenery present. The protective association is even stronger present when there is a substantial amount of greenery, with skin cancer as a notable exception, as I mentioned before. And other greenery in the wider environment does not appear to be able to compensate for the absence of an own private garden with garden greenery in this respect. And since people with a lower socioeconomic status tend to live in an apartment much more often than more wealthy people, and apartments not having a garden, and this is likely to continue in this way in the case of urban densification. Urban densification is likely to negatively affect the health of residents, especially of those with a low socioeconomic status. As we saw in the previous presentation, in many cases, urban densification takes place on what used to be green space. And if it's green space within the city limits, then there will be less green space available anyway. But also the amount of green space per inhabitant will become lower, even if the densification takes place on areas that are not green, were not green to start with. Future research, something to look into is the issue of reverse causation as an issue. You can imagine that people might move to an apartment because of a poor health condition, to be nearer to health facilities. Sometimes people may pave their garden because they're not able to maintain the garden as they would like to do, also because of poor health conditions. So that might be a part of the reason for the association. And it would also be very interesting to look more into the plausible causal mechanisms behind the observed associations, because it's very unlikely that we will be able in the future to provide everybody with a substantial amount of garden greenery, private garden greenery. But if we know the mechanism, maybe we can come up with ways to compensate for the absence of a garden with a lot of garden greenery. And one interesting hypothesis in this regard is the biodiversity hypothesis, which states that contact with nature influences the composition of your gut microbiome, which in turn influences the functioning of your immune system. It can improve the functioning if the gut microbiome is composed more beneficially, with a lower prevalence of health conditions as a result. So maybe it's not a future to look forward to, perhaps, but maybe one way to compensate for the lack of a garden with a lot of greenery is to have a fecal transplant. And here you see an example of the first fecal transplant in a Dutch hospital.
Are you wrapping it up now, Seb?
This is my last slide.
Perfect.
So this article has been published. That's the first you see in Environment International. And if you're also interested in urban densification, access to green space and well-being, we just published a chapter on that in that book, which is not open access, but available upon request. Thank you.
Thank you very much. This is great. Actually, your presentation, Sharp, generated some questions on in the chat, and I'll start with the very last one. And this is an interesting question. Has the presence of a balcony in apartments been studied? I mean, you talk about private gardens and private greeneries, but what about balconies?
No, we did not look at balconies. There's also a bit of a problem with using aerial photography in balconies. If they're, I don't know the English word, if they're not on the outside extending from your wall, but on the inside, the aerial photograph cannot show you what's there. So we only looked at gardens, and we had, because of problems, you could say, with the GIS data, determining the size, a minimum size of 5 square meters.
Okay.
Otherwise, you were not considered to have a domestic garden.
Maybe we can bring the other presentators back on screen, Erik, so we can just, in case there are other questions, but I have another one for you, Sharp. What is the health data availability, central database, individual level, or similar aspects? And how did you connect it to individual garden data?
The health data, there's an organization doing health research in the Netherlands, located in Utrecht, and in this project we work together. So they get the data from GPs of all the patients in their practice. And in the Netherlands, inhabitants are required to register with a GP. So it's not from all GP practice, but from quite a lot. Because of privacy reasons, you have to work with a trusted third party, Statistics Netherlands in this case. We developed our garden green space database, sent it to Statistics Netherlands, and based on I think it was the address. Yeah, the address. The two databases were linked on an individual level.
Okay.
After that, they removed the address, and we could analyze the data on a server of Statistics Netherlands and have outputs approved by them for exporting them out of the secured environment.
Okay. Actually, Marianne, she's asking you a question. Before I can give the word to her, I have another one on spuriosity. How did you manage to control for spurious effects on other variables impacting health? You refer to that in your second last slide, but how did you control for other dimensions that could actually then create, just an indirect impact on your health assessments?
That was done by statistical means, multi-level logistic regression analysis. So,
okay.
Yeah.
Okay. Marianne, there's a lot of questions to you, Sharp, but actually you were the one generating most. And Leah's question was actually, she actually answered the question. So in that sense, it's handled. So Marianne, would you like to be honest, I really don't understand what you're asking. So please put it forward.
So yeah, thank you very much. That was really interesting. When you had this, the impact on the different health conditions, and then the intestinal tract infection was so much more, so less prevalence of that compared to the others. Why do you think that stands out?
Well, that kind of put me to the biodiversity hypothesis, that contact with nature influences the composition of your gut microbiome. And thereby your immune system functioning. And for me, it is a kind of nice explanation in the sense it's a kind of central pathway, because we find associations for so many different health conditions. And you can say, oh yeah, for each you have to come up with an own unique pathway. But if it's by way of the immune system functioning, then if your immune system doesn't function very well, what will present itself as the first illness depends on your personal vulnerability. For the one, it will be this health condition. For the other one, it will be that health condition. So in that sense, it's a parsimonious explanation. And I had contact with a microbiologist in Wageningen Research. We talked about it. She said, well, she was very hesitant to say, okay, if just walking through nature, will it really already affect your gut microbiome? But recently there was a study that looked specifically at that, an experimental study, and it did show that just walking and sitting in nature affected the composition of your gut microbiome in a beneficial way. So I think it's an interesting hypothesis.
Yeah, great. Thank you very much.
I think this is great. I would actually like to continue, because a lot of questions that could actually be raised from having these interesting presentations on urban environmental sustainability. We have given you a public tour in public gardens in London, Paris, Oslo, and Warsaw. But in addition, with you, Sharp, you also extended the approach from the public to the private gardens. Even if you didn't look at the balconies, we did at least look at your figures. It's really interesting. And this is not my cup of tea, but I need to look into this because this obviously is very convincing results that you are presenting. But what we have given you, would you like to have a last wrap up before I just finalize the seminar? Anything else you would like to add? Or?
Well, for the interesting was the preceding presentation by Susanna was about densification being compact cities being beneficial with regard to some aspects, but the garden study shows it might be not that beneficial for your health in other aspects. So
okay,
that's very interesting. We often think of health as just one thing, health, but it has many different aspects.
But it's great because, you know, we have been 6 researchers from the peer institutes, and we have some additional institutes in peer which has not been contributing here, but they can definitely contribute in forthcoming webinars or scientific activities. But the point is that peer is a network. It's a platform where we gather and share our results and our experiences, and hopefully I hope that, and thanks to you all, we have hopefully provided some interesting insights into an extremely interesting problematic but challenge on urban environmental sustainability. So I will thank you, and I will also thank the technical coordinator, Eric, who managed to get us together. And I wish you all, and I just wrap this all up, and I wish you all a very, very nice day, and I wish you all the best health. Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye.